In the year 1021 AD, something seemingly impossible occurred on the shores of North America. The most formidable warriors Earth had ever known, Vikings who had brought half of Europe to its knees in submission, encountered their ultimate match. Not from a mighty empire with vast armies or a disciplined military force, but from canoes paddled by native defenders who had never laid eyes on iron weapons before this moment. Within a matter of days, the seemingly unstoppable Norse expansion that had dominated Europe ground to a permanent, shocking halt that would echo through centuries. Imagine this scene unfolding before your eyes in vivid detail. Battle-hardened Vikings, the same men who had successfully raided the streets of Paris and conquered the fields of England, now running desperately for their longboats through the dense Newfoundland forests. Behind them in the shadows, movement flickers between ancient trees. Arrows whistle through the air past their helmeted heads with deadly precision. These are the identical warriors who had laughed in the face of death itself on countless European battlefields, now fleeing in genuine terror from hunters they dismissively called Skraelings, wretched ones. A full 470 years before Christopher Columbus ever conceived of sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean, Vikings had already established permanent colonies on the North American continent. They named this land Vinland, meaning land of wine, a place blessed with rich fertile soil, endless forests of timber perfect for shipbuilding, wild grapes growing in natural abundance, a paradise for a civilization that had been cramped on frozen rocky islands for generations of hardship. By the time you finish reading this comprehensive account, you'll comprehend precisely how Stone Age weapons decisively defeated advanced steel technology, why the Vikings never attempted to return to these shores, and understand the single pivotal moment that saved Native America from Norse conquest centuries before Columbus. You'll witness how terrain, tactics, and determination overcame technological superiority in one of history's most consequential battles. But here's the part that mainstream history books deliberately omit or simply don't tell you with any clarity. First, the secret weapon that struck genuine terror into the hearts of Viking berserkers, men who fought bears for sport and entertainment without hesitation. Second, the tactical brilliance of the native ambush strategy that transformed forest terrain into an impenetrable fortress that negated every Viking advantage. Third, how a single panicked bull fundamentally changed the trajectory of human history in ways no one could have predicted. Fourth, the psychological warfare that broke men who had never known fear. Fifth, the forest fighting techniques that would be rediscovered centuries later in Vietnam and Afghanistan. How could warriors who successfully raided Paris and held it for ransom find themselves fleeing in panic from fur traders and hunters? What exactly transpired in those dark forests that haunted Norse sagas for centuries afterward? Why did these masters of medieval warfare abandon paradise itself? These aren't merely rhetorical questions designed to provoke thought. They're essential keys to understanding a battle that redirected 5 full centuries of human civilization down a completely different path than seemed inevitable. Days before the main conflict erupted, Thorvald Eriksson stood on these very same shores, examining a grievous wound. "This arrow will be the cause of my death," he prophesied with eerie accuracy, carefully pulling a stone point from beneath his arm where it had penetrated his armor's gap. the son of the legendary Eric the Red, biological brother to Leif the Lucky, died within mere hours of speaking those fateful words. His prophecy came devastatingly true, but his death was merely the beginning of a much larger catastrophe that would spell doom for Norse ambitions in the New World. To fully comprehend how the undisputed masters of medieval warfare encountered their definitive match, we must first understand with precision who these Vikings truly were and what they represented to the medieval world they dominated. If you find yourself fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, where underdogs changed the entire world against impossible odds, hit that like button right now and subscribe for more epic war content that challenges everything you thought you knew about military history. Ring the bell notification to witness how history's greatest warriors met their ultimate match in the most unexpected place imaginable. Now, let me transport your imagination back to the pivotal year 1000 AD, where our story truly begins in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Europe in the year 1000 trembled at the mere utterance of one single word: Viking. Let me paint you a picture of what this word meant to the medieval world. From the northern seas came dragon ships that moved like sharks through water, silent and deadly until the moment of attack. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were a civilization built on expansion, on the fundamental belief that strength and courage determined who owned what land. The Viking Age had transformed Northern Europe completely over 2 centuries of relentless expansion. Monasteries that once stood as beacons of learning lay in ruins, their treasures melted down for Norse ornaments. Entire kingdoms had been carved out by Viking swords: the Danelaw in England, Normandy in France, Dublin and York under Norse rule. These weren't mere raids anymore. These were conquests that rewrote maps and crowned Norse kings. From London's burning churches to Paris's ransomed walls, from monasteries stripped bare to villages left in ashes, Norse longships appearing on the horizon meant death, destruction, and devastation on an unimaginable scale. Their expansion across the known world seemed completely unstoppable, an inexorable tide of conquest that swept all before it. The very name struck fear into the hearts of kings and peasants alike. But what made Vikings so terrifyingly effective? It wasn't just brutality. Many cultures could match them in violence. It was their combination of seafaring mastery, tactical flexibility, and absolute fearlessness that made them unique. A Viking warrior was trained from childhood, not just to fight, but to believe that dying in combat guaranteed entrance to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight eternally. This wasn't just religious belief. It was psychological warfare that made them genuinely fearless in battle. Their ships were engineering marvels that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Shallow draft meant they could navigate rivers deep into continental Europe where no one expected seaborne attack. Lightweight construction allowed warriors to literally carry their ships overland between waterways. They could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before organized resistance could form. No medieval kingdom had the infrastructure to defend every possible landing site simultaneously. The Viking military system was sophisticated beyond what most people realize. They weren't just berserker barbarians swinging axes randomly. They had organized ranks, battle formations, tactical doctrines passed down through generations. Shield wall tactics had been refined over centuries of warfare into an almost unbeatable formation on open ground. Each man protected his neighbor with overlapping shields while thrusting spears through gaps. Breaking a properly formed Viking shield wall required either overwhelming numbers or cavalry charges, and Vikings fought with their backs to their ships, meaning enemies had to break them or watch them escape by sea. Iceland had fallen to Norse settlement first, a stepping stone into the Atlantic. Greenland had fallen next, despite its harsh climate and limited resources. Even the vast Atlantic Ocean itself couldn't contain their burning ambition for new lands and fresh conquests. The Norse were the dominant military force of their era, and they knew it with absolute certainty. Their reputation preceded them everywhere they sailed. The Norse worldview drove this expansion relentlessly. In their cosmology, the world was divided into realms: Midgard for humans, Asgard for gods, and countless other lands waiting to be discovered. They believed literally that brave men who sailed far enough would find new lands blessed by the gods. Vinland seemed to confirm this belief, a land so rich it validated every saga about divine rewards for courage. Their economic system also demanded expansion. Viking society was built on prestige and gift-giving. A jarl, a Norse nobleman, maintained power by distributing wealth to followers. This wealth came from raiding and trading. As trade routes became established and raiding became less profitable in well-defended areas, new frontiers became essential. Vinland represented an entire new world of resources to exploit: timber, furs, fish, possibly even the legendary Arab silver that traders spoke of existing somewhere in the West. The demographic pressure was equally important. Norse society practiced primogeniture. The eldest son inherited everything. Younger sons had three choices: become warriors serving their elder brother, enter the church, or seek their fortune elsewhere. This created a constant stream of ambitious young men eager to carve out kingdoms of their own. Iceland had absorbed one generation, Greenland another. Vinland seemed like the logical next step in this pattern of expansion that had worked for 2 centuries. 3 legendary names would inscribe this particular chapter of history in blood and saga, names that would be remembered for generations. Leif Erikson, the Lucky, Christianity's newest warrior convert who had discovered Vinland entirely by fortunate accident during a storm-blown voyage intended for Greenland. His brother Thorvald Iron Arm, seeking glory and fame to match his already famous sibling's reputation and honor. And Thorfinn Karlsefni the Wealthy, a merchant prince who saw rivers of gold where other men merely saw grapes and timber, a visionary who understood the economic potential of the New World. Leif's discovery had been accidental but providential. Sailing from Norway to Greenland, his ship had been blown off course by storms, a common occurrence in North Atlantic navigation. When the weather cleared, he found himself approaching an unknown coastline. What he saw amazed him. Forests stretching to the horizon, rich soil, abundant wildlife. He landed, explored briefly, loaded his ship with timber samples and wild grapes, then returned to Greenland with tales of a new land. The stories Leif told sparked imaginations across Greenland. Timber alone made Vinland valuable beyond measure. Greenland had virtually no trees, forcing settlers to import every piece of wood at enormous cost. But Leif described forests so vast you couldn't see their end, trees so tall they dwarfed anything in Norway. for a people struggling to survive on a frozen island, this was paradise itself. Thorvald's expedition came next, driven by ambition and brotherly competition. He would not just visit Vinland, he would explore it thoroughly, find the best settlement sites, prepare the ground for colonization. His confidence was absolute. He had fought in Europe, raided monasteries, survived battles. What could primitives with stone tools possibly do to him? Karlsefni represented the third phase, actual colonization rather than exploration. He brought families, livestock, supplies for permanent settlement. He was a wealthy merchant who understood economics. Vinland offered everything a medieval economy needed: raw materials, agricultural land, trade goods. He intended to establish a trading empire that would make him the richest man in the Norse world. His vision was commercial as much as martial. Peaceful trade would make everyone wealthy. Warfare would be unnecessary. But who exactly were the Skraelings that the sagas mention with such contempt? The Norse word itself translates roughly to wretched ones or inferior people, reflecting the Viking assumption of superiority. Yet these supposedly wretched ones would accomplish what no organized European army had ever managed to do: defeat Viking warriors on their own terms and send them fleeing back across the Atlantic. The term Skraelings reveals Viking prejudice perfectly. They used the same word for any indigenous people they encountered, whether in Vinland or Greenland, whether forest dwellers or coastal fishermen. To Norse eyes, anyone without iron weapons, without written language, without Christian God was inherently inferior. This arrogance would prove fatal. Modern archaeological evidence combined with genetic studies and careful analysis suggests they were likely Beothuk hunters, possibly ancestors of the Delaware people, maybe representatives of both groups and others from the region. The Beothuk were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who had inhabited Newfoundland for thousands of years. They knew every stream, every game trail, every edible plant. They could read weather patterns in the sky, track animals by broken twigs, navigate forests in complete darkness by feel and sound alone. Their society, while lacking writing, possessed complex oral traditions that preserved tactical knowledge across generations. Young warriors learned from elders who had learned from their elders in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. Battle tactics that worked got remembered and taught. Tactics that failed were forgotten. This evolutionary process had created a military culture perfectly adapted to their environment in ways Vikings couldn't match. Their weapons seemed primitive: stone instead of iron, wood instead of steel. But this was adaptation, not inferiority. Stone points shattered inside wounds, making removal agonizing and infection almost certain. Wooden bows were silent compared to crossbows. Tomahawks could be thrown or used in close combat with equal effectiveness. Every weapon was designed specifically for forest warfare, where silence and versatility mattered more than raw power. What truly matters for our story is this fundamental fact. They knew their native land with the same intimate familiarity that Vikings knew the temperamental sea. Every stream, every game trail, every hiding spot. The terrain was their oldest and most reliable ally. They had walked these forests since childhood, learning every secret the land held. Vinland represented absolutely everything that Norse expansion desperately craved and needed for survival in their harsh northern world. Timber for constructing ships, Greenland possessed virtually none of sufficient quality for ocean-going vessels. Grapes for producing wine, worth literally more than gold in medieval European markets, where wine was both sacrament and currency, essential for religious ceremonies and trade. Fertile soil perfect for farming after generations of rocky frozen ground that barely yielded crops. Abundant game for hunting and survival through long winters. Iron bog deposits for forging weapons and tools without relying on expensive imports. It was paradise incarnate compared to Greenland's ice prison existence, a land of plenty that seemed to promise prosperity for generations. The sagas themselves describe butterflies so thick they resembled falling snow blanketing the ground. Salmon practically leaping into fishing nets of their own accord, so abundant that catching them required no skill. Winters as mild as Norwegian spring, almost tropical by Norse standards accustomed to months of darkness and ice. The land seemed to welcome settlement with open arms, offering everything a growing colony could possibly need. Why stop the expansion at harsh Iceland with its volcanic soil and limited resources? Why settle permanently for Greenland's frozen misery when paradise beckoned just across the western waters? The core Viking mindset demanded constant expansion. Their very gods rewarded the bold and punished the timid. Each generation bore the cultural obligation to claim new lands or face eternal shame in the halls of their ancestors. Younger sons needed kingdoms of their own to rule. Ships required constant timber for construction and repair. Growing populations needed fresh food sources. Expansion wasn't merely desirable, it was existentially necessary for survival of Norse culture itself. Consider carefully the profound strategic implications involved in the Vinland enterprise. Greenland survived precariously on exactly two things: sporadic European trade that could be cut off at any moment, and desperate hope for the future. Hope that somewhere across the mysterious Western Sea lay sufficient resources to sustain their precarious existence on the edge of the known world. Vinland's discovery validated that fragile hope completely and absolutely. Establishing permanent defensible settlements there would secure Norse dominance in the North Atlantic for centuries to come, creating a chain of colonies stretching from Norway to America. Fail, and Greenland itself might slowly wither and die. Cut off from both Europe and resources, its population forced to abandon their settlements or perish in the ice. The native inhabitants had been watching these strange, pale visitors carefully before any violence occurred. When Leif first landed years earlier during his initial exploration, they had observed silently from forest edges, studied their peculiar iron tools with wonder and concern, counted their numbers with precision, marked their daily habits and routines with hunters' patience. They understood immediately that these foreigners represented both opportunity and threat. Where Vikings saw empty wilderness ripe for claiming according to their customs, native peoples saw their ancient homeland suddenly under existential threat from foreign invasion. Two completely incompatible worldviews were about to collide with explosive, history-altering force. The Vikings believed in conquest and settlement, taking what they needed from the land. The natives believed in stewardship and balance, living with the land rather than dominating it. What the Vikings discovered across the Atlantic would systematically shatter every fundamental assumption about warfare they held sacred from generations of European combat. Their much vaunted tactical superiority meant absolutely nothing in this alien environment. Their steel advantage minimized to near irrelevance against enemies who knew how to exploit every weakness. Their famous battle formations rendered completely useless in terrain where they couldn't form proper lines. The very landscape itself seemed to fight against them with conscious malevolence, as if the forest itself rejected their presence. Trees provided endless cover for concealed enemies who could strike and vanish like ghosts. Rivers allowed rapid movement invisible to foreign eyes unfamiliar with the waterways. Forests that appeared as impenetrable maze to strangers became highways for native feet that had walked them since childhood, knowing every path by heart. Every environmental factor favored the defender who had grown up in this terrain. The psychological element proved equally crucial to the physical terrain in determining the battle's outcome. Vikings had always conquered primarily through cultivated fear and reputation built over generations. Their fearsome reputation preceded them across Europe. The mere sight of dragon-prowed ships sent peasants fleeing to churches for sanctuary. But here in Vinland, they had no reputation whatsoever. No fear preceded them. Only strange foreigners in strange boats, badly outnumbered and impossibly far from home and reinforcements. The intimidation factor that worked flawlessly from Ireland to Russia meant absolutely nothing to people who had never even heard Norse names spoken or seen their dragon ships. Most critically for our understanding of what followed, Vikings excelled specifically at set-piece battles fought on their terms. Shield walls on open ground where discipline mattered most. Cavalry charges across open plains where shock tactics worked perfectly. Naval engagements in familiar fjords where seamanship determined victory. These were their proven strengths, honed over generations of warfare across Europe and perfected through countless battles. But forest warfare, ambush tactics from concealment, guerrilla resistance that refused to stand and fight honorably. These combat methods weren't merely absent from their military playbook. They contradicted everything Vikings knew about honorable warfare between warriors. They'd foolishly entered an arena where every single rule they knew was fundamentally wrong and worked against them, where heavy armor became burdensome liability that slowed movement, where tight formations became concentrated targets for arrows, where traditional bravery became suicidal foolishness that got men killed. The Viking force that arrived in 1021 AD represented Norse colonization at its absolute peak of ambition and capability, the culmination of years of planning. 160 total settlers, including women and children who would farm and build the new society. 30 battle-hardened warriors in full mail armor, veterans of European campaigns who had survived countless battles. 5 sturdy longships carrying everything needed to establish a permanent New World settlement that would endure. Led by the wealthy merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni, they brought comprehensive supplies, cattle for farming and breeding stock, tools for construction of buildings, weapons for conquest, and defense against any threat. Analyze their formidable arsenal with military precision, and you'll understand why they felt confident. Each professional warrior carried a devastating two-handed battle axe weighing up to 4 pounds, capable of cleaving through shields and skulls alike in close combat with a single blow. Round wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses at the center for punching and blocking. Chainmail shirts worth small fortunes protecting vital organs from most weapons of the era, iron helmets without horns, despite persistent Hollywood mythology to the contrary, expensive swords for the wealthy elite who could afford them, sturdy spears for common fighters, the weapon of choice for most. Powerful bows pulling 80 pounds of draw weight, deadly accurate at 100 yards in trained hands. Against this medieval military, might that had conquered half of Europe, the native defenders carried weapons that seemed laughably primitive to European eyes, but would prove perfectly adapted to their forest environment. Bows of hickory and elm wood, pulling only 60 pounds compared to Viking bows, but wielded by lifetime hunters who could thread arrows through impossible forest gaps with supernatural accuracy born of endless practice. Perfectly balanced tomahawks, designed for both throwing at distance and close combat. 3 strikes per second possible in practiced hands that had trained since childhood. Stone arrowheads specifically designed to shatter inside wounds, making removal agonizing and infection likely. But their greatest weapon was knowledge itself, intimate familiarity with every game trail, every hiding spot, every tactical advantage the land offered to those born to it. The terrain itself had already chosen sides before the first arrow flew in anger. Newfoundland's dense forests differed completely from any European battlefield Vikings had encountered in their careers. Thick undergrowth that grabbed at legs and tangled feet with every step. Forest canopy so impenetrably dense that noon felt like perpetual dusk, limiting visibility. Natural sounds muffled and distorted by vegetation, making it impossible to locate enemies by sound. Sightlines measured in feet rather than the hundreds of yards Vikings were accustomed to on European plains. Warriors trained for disciplined shield wall combat found themselves constantly scattered, isolated, vulnerable to unseen enemies who struck from nowhere. Pre-contact tensions had been building slowly but inevitably, like gathering storm clouds. Native scouts had been watching carefully since the very first Viking landing years before. They saw foreign strangers cutting down sacred trees without permission or ceremony. They observed them taking resources without asking or offering anything in return according to native customs. They counted Viking warriors with tactical precision, noting their weapons and armor. They noted their routines and patrol patterns, learning when guards changed and where hunting parties traveled. From perfect concealment that Vikings never suspected, native scouts studied Viking behavior patterns with hunters' patience accumulated over generations. When did sentries change shifts? Where did hunting parties travel regularly? How quickly could Vikings form defensive battle lines when surprised? What were their blind spots? Every piece of information was gathered, analyzed, shared among the tribes through the extensive network of relationships. This intelligence gathering was systematic and thorough. But wait, the forest had eyes everywhere, always watching from the shadows. The first recorded violent encounter came when a Viking patrol discovered 9 native people sleeping peacefully under overturned canoes on a beach. 8 died before they could even rise or defend themselves, cut down by Viking steel without mercy or warning. 1 man escaped into the forest, wounded but alive, running with desperate speed. That single survivor would change everything that followed, becoming the messenger who triggered war. Within mere hours, every native group within 50 miles knew about the pale-skinned strangers who killed without warning or provocation. The news spread through the forest with remarkable speed via runners and signal fires. The message was clear and unambiguous. These foreigners were deadly threats who must be dealt with. They showed no respect for native people or customs. They killed sleeping people without cause. Thorvald Eriksson himself commanded that first brutal contact that set events in motion. "Skraelings," he sneered dismissively upon seeing their hide clothing and stone weapons, assuming easy victory over primitives. His arrogance would prove immediately fatal to himself and his ambitions. As his men celebrated their apparently easy victory over primitives they considered inferior, Thorvald noticed ominous movement on the water's surface that made his blood run cold. Skin boats, dozens of them, approaching fast and with clear hostile intent. He ordered immediate shield wall formation, the standard Viking response to any threat that had worked countless times before. But there wasn't nearly enough time to properly organize the formation. The retaliatory arrow came from seemingly nowhere, from an impossible angle through the trees. Later, sagas would describe it as guided by fate itself, as if the gods had turned against the Norse and chosen to punish their arrogance. The arrow curved impossibly around Thorvald's raised shield, finding the narrow gap beneath his arm where armor couldn't possibly protect, a target requiring either divine intervention or incredible skill accumulated through years of practice. A stone point crafted by supposedly primitive hands felled the mighty son of Eric the Red in seconds. "I have gotten a good land firmly in my grasp, though I'll enjoy little benefit from it," he gasped with his final breaths, understanding too late his fatal mistake. Within hours, he was dead, the first Viking to die in the New World, but far from the last. His death became a warning that went unheeded. This single death changed absolutely everything about the dynamics of Norse-native relations. Where Vikings had confidently expected easy conquest over primitives with stone weapons, they found determined, skilled resistance from experienced warriors. Where they had anticipated fighting primitive savages with inferior technology, they encountered genuine tactical sophistication that matched or exceeded their own. The natives had spent countless generations perfecting forest warfare techniques passed down through oral tradition. Every child learned to move absolutely silently through dense undergrowth before they learned to walk properly. Every hunter could vanish into green shadows like smoke dissipating. Every warrior knew instinctively that patience trumped aggression every time in forest combat. The fundamental pattern was now set for everything that would follow. Viking direct aggression met native tactical adaptation, open heroic combat versus hidden calculated strikes from ambush, steel strength against stone cunning and guile accumulated over generations. Two completely incompatible military philosophies colliding violently in Newfoundland's dark, primeval forests that had stood for millennia. Neither side understood the other's language, customs, or intentions in the slightest, but both understood violence's universal language perfectly. War was now inevitable. Thorfinn Karlsefni arrived the following year with his massive, well-planned expedition that represented years of preparation. He knew about his predecessor Thorvald's violent death, but dismissed it as simple bad luck and poor judgment rather than a warning. Thorvald had been recklessly careless in his approach, unnecessarily aggressive in his tactics, foolishly arrogant in his assumptions. Karlsefni would be completely different, cautious in his movements, diplomatic in his approach, intelligent in his strategy. He brought valuable trade goods alongside weapons, showing he understood commerce as well as conquest. His strategy seemed sound and reasonable. Establish peaceful relations first through trade and mutual benefit. Use overwhelming force only if absolutely necessary as a last resort. History itself pivoted on this crucial decision to attempt diplomacy. Karlsefni wisely chose a defensible position near the coast that offered strategic advantages. High ground with clear fields of fire in all directions, allowing sentries to spot approaching enemies. Longhouses specifically built with defense in mind, with reinforced walls and narrow windows. Sentries posted vigilantly day and night without exception, rotating shifts to maintain alertness. He would absolutely not repeat Thorvald's fatal mistakes that had cost Norse lives, but the natives had learned extensively from that earlier violent encounter too. They now understood Viking weapons intimately, having examined the bodies and weapons left behind. They comprehended their standard tactics and formations. Most importantly, they knew with absolute certainty that Vikings could die just like any other men. They weren't supernatural beings. With Thorvald's blood permanently staining American soil, the stage was set for an encounter that would determine whether Europe would colonize America 5 full centuries early or not at all. The next confrontation would be decisive. Dawn broke over Karlsefni's fortified settlement with deceptive, misleading peace that suggested nothing was wrong. Day 1 brought complete surprise. Canoes emerging from morning mist like ghosts materializing from nowhere, appearing suddenly. Vikings scrambled frantically for weapons, shields raised defensively, arrows nocked and ready to fire. But the natives didn't attack immediately. They simply stared across the water in silent assessment. Both sides frozen in mutual assessment and calculation, each trying to understand the other's intentions. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the canoes withdrew back into the mist, leaving Vikings confused. Hearts pounded in the aftermath. What did this strange encounter mean? Was it reconnaissance? A test of Viking readiness? Day 3 changed everything about the dynamic between the two groups. The natives returned bearing valuable furs worth fortunes. The universal trade language, goods for goods, commerce over conflict. Karlsefni made what seemed like a brilliant tactical decision at the time, showing his merchant instincts. He offered milk from their European cattle, something completely unknown in the New World. The natives had never tasted anything like it before in their lives. Their genuine wonder at this strange white liquid broke the building tension like sunshine through clouds. Laughter replaced suspicion. Trade began tentatively with simple exchanges. For precious moments that stretched into hours, history itself teetered precariously toward genuine peace that might have changed everything. Natives brought exquisite pelts worth absolute fortunes in European markets, where furs commanded premium prices. Vikings offered milk and exotic red cloth, treasures to native eyes accustomed to natural materials. No common language existed between them, but pointing and gestures sufficed for basic commerce that transcended words. Curious children peered from behind their mothers, fascinated by the strangers. Wary warriors gradually lowered weapons on both sides. Perhaps Vinland could be peacefully shared after all, with both peoples benefiting from trade. But here's where the sagas go conspicuously silent about a crucial detail that changed everything in an instant. A young native warrior, fascinated by the perfection of Viking steel that gleamed in the sunlight, reached tentatively for an axe to examine it more closely. Its weight, balance, edge, all alien perfection to someone who had known only stone tools throughout his life. A Viking moved to stop him from taking it, fearing theft. Hands grabbed in struggle. The brief struggle lasted mere seconds but seemed eternal. The axe fell. Blood sprayed across trade goods and peaceful intentions, staining everything. Whose blood? The sagas differ and contradict each other. Viking or native, accident or deliberate attack. What matters is this simple fact. Trust died completely in that single moment, shattered beyond repair. The native grabbed the bloodied axe and ran toward the forest at full speed. His people vanished into green shadows within heartbeats, melting away like smoke. Behind them, a corpse and shattered piece lay on the beach. The milk of friendship curdled instantly into the poison of inevitable war. Everything that had been built collapsed in seconds. Hour by hour, Vikings fortified frantically, working with desperate energy born of fear. Longhouse doors reinforced with extra timber beams. Weapons distributed to every adult capable of fighting, even those who had never held a weapon. Shields hung on walls for instant access during attack. Women taught basic combat stances they'd never imagined needing in their lives. The settlement transformed from peaceful trading post to military camp in hours. Karlsefni knew exactly what was coming with absolute certainty. The only questions remaining were when the attack would come and how many enemies they would face. In forest shadows invisible to Viking eyes, native councils convened with serious purpose in clearings known only to them. The death, whether Viking or their own, demanded response according to ancient custom and honor. But these weren't simple revenge seekers acting from emotion alone. They were experienced strategists who had defended this land successfully for countless generations against various threats, including hostile tribes. Tribal elders spoke wisely of Viking weaknesses they'd observed during trading interactions and previous encounters. Their heavy armor slowed them down significantly in rough terrain. Their famous formations required open ground to function properly. They relied primarily on sight, not sound or other senses in combat. They knew absolutely nothing of proper forest ways or woodland survival. The analysis was thorough and tactical, drawing on collective wisdom. Then came the vanishing that unnerved Vikings more than open attack would have. No natives appeared for days afterward. Viking patrols found absolutely nothing but oppressive silence in the forest. This psychological warfare worked perfectly on European minds unused to such tactics. Every snapping branch became an approaching enemy in their imagination. Every bird call might signal attack from hidden warriors. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, leaving men exhausted. Nerves frayed hour by hour under the stress. Seasoned warriors jumped at mere shadows cast by moonlight. The waiting itself became a devastating weapon, more effective than arrows. But the forest wasn't actually empty, far from it. Viking patrols found subtle signs for those who could properly read them, evidence of constant observation. Broken arrows left deliberately in obvious paths, warnings or threats meant to be found. Footprints that mysteriously appeared and vanished, suggesting watchers. How many watched from perfect concealment at any given moment? Fresh tree marks appearing overnight, counting Viking numbers or marking attack routes for the assault. The evidence mounted steadily day by day. They were completely surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with successfully. On the fourth endless night, Karlsefni made a desperate decision born of frustration and fear. He would send a strong patrol deep into the forest to find the native camps, negotiate or intimidate, whatever worked to break the stalemate that was draining morale. 10 of his absolute best warriors vanished into green darkness, carrying torches for light. They returned at dawn, pale and genuinely shaken to their cores by what they'd experienced. They'd found nothing but felt eyes everywhere, constantly watching. One warrior swore he'd been physically touched in the darkness by unseen hands that vanished when he turned. Another heard steady breathing beside him throughout the entire night. The forest itself seemed actively hostile to foreign presence, as if the land rejected them. The calm before storm pressed down like physical weight on everyone in the settlement. Vikings performed weapon drills obsessively, repetitively, trying to maintain readiness. Sharpened already sharp blades until edges gleamed like mirrors. Checked and rechecked armor straps until hands bled from the leather. But how do you properly prepare for an enemy you absolutely cannot see or predict? How do you form effective shield walls against shadows that won't stand and fight? Every Viking military manual became useless paper in this situation. They were fighting the land itself, and the land was rapidly losing patience with their presence. What happened next defied every established rule of medieval warfare that Vikings knew from generations of European combat. As the fifth dawn approached with ominous stillness, sentries noticed something impossible, something that made no logical sense to their eyes. The forest edge, clearly visible moments before, seemed closer somehow to the settlement, not actively moving, just closer than it had been. Then they realized the horrifying truth that turned their blood to ice. It wasn't the forest moving at all. It was what came from within it in the darkness. Hundreds of skin boats materialized from hidden coves, like ghosts taking physical form. They moved in perfect coordination, precise as any European army formation. No war cries, no horns, just silent approach that chilled blood more than any battle rage could have. The Vikings had expected screaming charges like European enemies always made in their experience. This disciplined advance was far more terrifying than any berserker rage. These weren't savages acting from emotion. These were professionals who had turned their homeland into a weapon against invaders. When the sun fully rose on the fifth day, the Vikings would face a completely new form of warfare they'd never imagined possible in their worst nightmares. Dawn exploded violently into chaos without warning. Hundreds of canoes swept from 3 directions simultaneously in perfectly coordinated attack. Ocean approach from the east, river flanking from the north, forest emergence from the west. The Vikings counted 30 boats, then 50, then simply stopped counting as numbers overwhelmed their ability to track. Each carried 5 to 8 warriors armed and ready. Simple mathematics turned terrifying when calculated. 300 attackers minimum against 30 armored Vikings and 130 settlers. The odds were catastrophic, and everyone knew it. First volley darkened the morning sky like a plague of locusts blocking out the sun. Vikings raised shields instinctively, forming the legendary wall that had never failed them throughout Europe. From England to Russia, the shield wall meant inevitable victory against any foe. overlapping wood and iron, each man protecting his neighbor, spears bristling outward like a human hedgehog. Arrows struck with sounds like hail on rooftops, hundreds of impacts. But then physics went completely wrong in ways that defied experience. Arrows began curving around shields as if guided by sorcery or divine intervention. The natives used shorter bows specifically designed for high trajectories rather than flat shooting. Arrows fell from above at steep angles like rain, finding narrow gaps between shields and helmets. A Viking screamed, arrow through his foot, pinning him in place. Another gasped, point finding the neck gap in his armor perfectly. The supposedly unbreakable wall began breaking under the assault. Native Tactic 1 revealed itself with devastating effectiveness, false retreats designed to break formations. A group charged Viking lines, throwing tomahawks, then fled toward forests as if routed. Young Vikings, blood hot with battle fury and desire for glory, pursued instinctively against orders. "Hold the wall!" Karlsefni screamed desperately, knowing what would happen. But warrior instincts overwhelmed discipline in the heat of combat. 5 Vikings chased 20 natives into the tree line. The trap snapped shut instantly with brutal efficiency. Those 20 became 60 as concealed warriors rose from undergrowth, like earth itself, birthing warriors. The 5 Vikings found themselves surrounded, separated from their comrades, doomed within seconds of entering the forest. Close combat erupted exactly as natives wanted and planned. In open ground, Viking axes devastated enemies with sweeping blows. In thick forest, their long handles caught constantly on branches and undergrowth. Heavy armor exhausted them rapidly in the heat. Meanwhile, natives danced through familiar terrain like smoke, tomahawks finding every armor gap with practiced ease born of intimate knowledge. Sensory overload consumed the battlefield in ways Vikings had never experienced. Viking war cries mixed with native ululation, creating cacophony. Steel rang against stone with metallic shrieks. Men screamed in languages neither understood, primal sounds of pain. The familiar stench of blood and fear filled nostrils, but mixed with alien smells: pine sap, unfamiliar plants, forest decay. Everything felt wrong, alien, terrifying to men raised in open European terrain. In the center of chaos, young Bjorn faced his first real combat against a true enemy. 19 summers old, trained since childhood in weapons, he thought himself ready for anything. The native warrior who faced him looked no older, equally young. They circled in a clearing barely 6 feet wide, assessing each other. Bjorn swung his axe confidently, a killing stroke in practice yards that had never failed. But here, the weapon embedded in a tree trunk, stuck fast. In that heartbeat of vulnerability, when he was defenseless, the tomahawk found his temple with precision. He fell without a sound, another casualty. Statistical shock mounted quickly as casualties accumulated. Within the first hour of combat, 8 Vikings dead, 12 wounded seriously. Only 4 confirmed native casualties could be counted. The kill ratio that should heavily favor steel wasn't happening at all. Contrary to expectations, worse, Viking casualties were permanent losses that couldn't be replaced. Native losses seemed to regenerate as forest continuously disgorged fresh warriors from hidden reserves. The forest maze claimed more victims hour by hour. Pursuing Vikings became hopelessly lost within 50 yards of camp in the identical-looking terrain. Every tree looked identical to foreign eyes. Sounds echoed deceptively through the canopy. Men who'd navigated trackless seas using sun and stars couldn't find their way back to camp through the trees. They called desperately for help, revealing positions to native hunters stalking them. One by one, isolated Vikings fell to arrows from invisible bows, picked off systematically. Native Tactic 2 demonstrated terrifying innovation never seen in Europe. Treetop archers using three-dimensional warfare. While Vikings searched at ground level for enemies, death came from directly above. Warriors had climbed trees in darkness before dawn, waiting patiently for hours. They rained arrows straight down where shields couldn't possibly protect from that angle. Helmets deflected some projectiles, but shoulders, feet, hands, all vulnerable from this angle. Vikings had never conceived of three-dimensional battlefield tactics before in their military experience. Then came the moment that should have turned the tide completely in Viking favor. Ragnar Ironside, Karlsefni's champion and best warrior, went berserk with battle fury. The legendary fury where pain vanished and strength doubled through rage. He charged alone into native ranks, axe whirling like a windmill, seemingly invulnerable to harm. Bodies fell around him like wheat before a scythe. Native lines wavered before this superhuman fury. But the forest doesn't respect berserkers or legends from Europe. Ragnar pursued fleeing natives into undergrowth, following them blindly. His fury made him careless about terrain. He didn't see the rope stretched between trees at ankle height. When he fell hard, 20 tomahawks found him simultaneously from all sides. The natives had studied Viking combat methods carefully during observations and developed specific counters to every tactic. Even berserker rage had limits against coordinated attacks. Bodies accumulated with shocking speed as the morning wore on. The pristine settlement became a charnel ground soaked with blood. Vikings dragged wounded comrades behind buildings, trying to protect them. Women emerged to defend their children, knives against tomahawks in desperate defense. But the native numbers seemed infinite and endless. For every warrior who fell, 2 emerged from forest shadows to replace him. Then the impossible happened that became legendary in sagas. Karlsefni's bull, brought for breeding stock to establish herds, broke free from its pen during the chaos. The massive beast, maddened by battle sounds and blood scent filling the air, charged through the combat zone with mindless fury and power. To Vikings, this was merely livestock panicking. To natives who'd never seen cattle before in their lives, this was a demon from nightmare given flesh. The bull's unexpected appearance shattered native momentum instantly and completely. Warriors who'd faced armored Vikings without flinching fled in terror from this bellowing monster with horns. Its horns caught one warrior, tossing him like a child's doll through the air. The psychological impact was instant and devastating to native morale. What other demons did these strangers command and control? Karlsefni seized the moment brilliantly, recognizing the opportunity. "Form up! Shield wall back to the longhouse!" Vikings retreated step by step, dragging wounded comrades, shields locked together. The bull's rampage bought precious minutes for reorganization. Native attack coordination collapsed as warriors dealt with this supernatural threat they couldn't understand. Some tried to kill it with arrows and spears, others fled in panic. Commands in different languages added to chaos and confusion. The temporary advantage let Vikings reach defensive positions before the natives could reorganize their assault. The longhouse, built specifically for this possibility with defense in mind, had firing slots and reinforced walls that could withstand sustained attack. Women passed water to exhausted warriors, tending their needs. Wounded received basic treatment to stop bleeding. Weapons were redistributed from the dead to the living. But the respite was brief, and everyone knew it. Outside the walls, natives regrouped with frightening speed, their discipline returning quickly. Night brought no relief whatsoever from the constant pressure. Native warriors knew darkness like old friends from childhood. Vikings, exhausted from daylight battle, faced fresh assaults from warriors who had rested. Fire arrows began falling on the longhouse roof like meteors. The wooden longhouse, their shelter and refuge, became a potential death trap that could burn. Bucket brigades formed hastily. Women and children fought flames desperately, while men held the walls against assault. Dawn revealed the full horror of their situation in harsh daylight. Viking dead, 11 confirmed fallen. Wounded, 19 with serious injuries. Combat effective, maybe 20 still able to fight. Native casualties impossible to count accurately in the chaos, but their numbers hadn't decreased at all visibly. If anything, more canoes dotted the water with reinforcements. More shadows flitted between trees constantly. The mathematics of annihilation became crystal clear to everyone. They couldn't win. They could only die gloriously or flee shamefully. The final assault came with disciplined coordination that showed native tactical mastery. Natives had spent the night planning carefully in council. No more piecemeal attacks that allowed defense. This time, simultaneous pressure from all sides to overwhelm the defenders. Fire arrows increased in volume, raining down constantly. Tomahawk throwers worked in coordinated teams, one to make Vikings raise shields defensively, another to exploit the opening created. The noose tightened inexorably around the settlement. Karlsefni faced the hardest decision of his life in that moment. Stay and die heroically for saga glory that would echo through generations, or retreat and live with shame that would haunt him forever. But shame meant nothing to dead men who couldn't tell stories. And these weren't just warriors. Women and children would die too in the slaughter. The merchant prince proved his wisdom in this moment. To the ships! The order that saved Norse lives, but ended Norse dreams forever of American colonization. The retreat became a fighting withdrawal against constant pressure. Vikings formed a hollow square, civilians in the center for protection, fighting toward the beach step by step. Every step cost blood as warriors fell. Natives pressed from all sides, sensing total victory within grasp. The 100 yards to the ships felt like miles under attack. Men who'd conquered half of Europe found themselves running desperately from primitives with stone weapons. Rearguard action fell to the bravest volunteers who knew their fate. 5 Vikings volunteered to hold the line while others boarded ships. They knew it meant certain death with no hope of survival. Their names deserve remembering through history and honor: Thorgar, Snorri, Grimol, Thorhall, Kettle. They stood shield to shield in unbreakable formation, buying time with their lives willingly. Songs should honor their sacrifice eternally in the great halls, but even sagas struggled to glorify retreat from inferior foes. As Longboat pushed off blood-soaked beaches with desperate oar strokes, the Vikings knew something unprecedented had happened in their history. The retreat turned into organized panic, barely controlled. Vikings abandoned everything they couldn't carry in one trip to the ships. The forge representing months of labor left standing abandoned. Precious iron tools scattered in dirt underfoot. Half-built structures that would puzzle archaeologists centuries later when discovered. Pride mattered less than survival in that moment. These weren't conquerors anymore. They were refugees fleeing for their lives across the ocean. What they left behind tells the story eloquently to those who understand. Iron nails worth fortunes in Greenland trampled carelessly into mud. The anvil carried across treacherous seas with such effort abandoned on the beach. Whetstones for sharpening, cooking pots, even weapons dropped by wounded men too weak to carry them. Each item represented dreams of permanent settlement and prosperity. Now they would just wait for scavengers, slowing escape with extra weight. The natives would collect these treasures later, proof of their victory over invaders. On the beach, final tragedy struck in the last moments. As the last longboat pushed off into the waves, an arrow whistled from the tree line with deadly accuracy. It caught the helmsman in the throat perfectly. He toppled backward, blood spraying across Karlsefni's face in warm droplets. The boat spun rudderless while men scrambled to take control of the tiller. Those final moments encapsulated everything about the battle. Even in victory, Vikings remained targets. Even escaping across water, death followed relentlessly. Native victory celebrations erupted as longboats vanished into morning mist like ghosts. Warriors who'd hidden fear behind battle masks now danced on blood-stained beaches in triumph. They'd done the impossible, defeated iron with stone tools, expelled invaders without surrendering sacred land. Women emerged from forest sanctuaries with relief. Children touched abandoned Viking weapons with wonder and awe. Elders nodded approval at young warriors who'd proved themselves in combat worthy of respect. The death count told a stark story when tallied carefully. Vikings, 15 confirmed dead in combat, 23 wounded with serious injuries, several who died during the voyage home from wounds. 1/3 of their fighting force eliminated completely. Natives, numbers disputed by different sagas, but likely fewer than 20 killed in the battle. The technological advantage had meant nothing in the end. Stone Age weapons in skilled hands had crushed Iron Age invaders completely. Psychological impact proved even more devastating than physical casualties in the long term. These Vikings had grown up on stories of invincibility and conquest. Their fathers conquered England and ruled it. Their grandfathers terrorized France and extracted tribute. They themselves had planned to add America to Norse dominions as the next conquest. Instead, they fled like whipped dogs from enemies they dismissed as wretches and primitives. Karlsefni made his final decision before they reached open ocean and safety. "This land wants us dead," he told his council grimly. No debate followed his declaration. Everyone had seen enough horror. Vinland's riches weren't worth Viking blood to claim. Let others chase that dream if they dared. The survivors would return to Greenland with lives, if not honor, intact. Sometimes wisdom means knowing when you're beaten thoroughly and accepting defeat. For the natives, immediate consequences were profound and far-reaching. They now possessed iron tools, weapons, and knowledge of foreign warfare. Viking tactics had been observed carefully, countered effectively, defeated completely. The defensive template was established for future conflicts. Future invaders would face people who knew European warfare intimately, and how to defeat it through superior tactics. The sagas wrote themselves within a generation as stories spread. How Karlsefni the Wealthy became Karlsefni the Wise by retreating strategically. How stone defeated steel against all expectations. How the New World rejected its would-be conquerors violently. Skald struggled with the narrative structure. How do you glorify defeat and retreat? They focused on individual heroism while acknowledging collective failure honestly. European expansion delayed by 500 years from this defeat. Consider the profound implications of this. If Vikings had established permanent settlements successfully, if they'd brought more colonists in waves, if they'd adapted to forest warfare and learned, history shifts completely on its axis. Columbus discovers a continent already carved into Norse kingdoms stretching from coast to coast. Native populations face European diseases centuries earlier than they did. The demographic collapse happens in 1100, not 1500 as it did. Everything changes fundamentally. The entire timeline of human history shifts. What if Vikings had succeeded in their colonization? Alternative history suggests terrifying possibilities worth considering. Norse Greenland, reinforced by Vinland resources and prosperity, survives the Little Ice Age that killed the historical settlement. Viking expansion continues southward along the coast systematically. They encounter Aztec and Inca empires at their peak power. Not weakened by Spanish conquistadors, but full-strength Norse armies with medieval technology. Medieval technology meets medieval technology on equal terms, the outcome unknowable, but certainly bloodier than what actually occurred with firearms against clubs. Native tactical innovations deserve serious military study even today. Their forest warfare techniques preceded similar developments by centuries in military history. Vietnam's tactics, Afghanistan's resistance, modern militaries learning what native defenders proved in 1021 AD. Technology alone doesn't guarantee victory in war. Terrain plus determination plus tactical adaptation can defeat any invader with superior weapons. The template was written in Newfoundland forests with blood and proved repeatedly since. Modern archaeological evidence confirms saga accounts with remarkable precision. L'Anse aux Meadows reveals Viking buildings exactly where stories place them. Carbon dating yields 1021 AD precisely as the sagas claimed. Tree rings don't lie to archaeologists. Artifacts match descriptions in oral tradition. Even the forge remains abandoned as sagas claimed for 1,000 years. Science validates oral history passed down through generations. The battles happened exactly as described. The Vikings fled in defeat. The natives won decisively. But here's the deeper lesson that transcends military history. The Vikings represented seeming inevitability, technological superiority, expansionist ideology, demographic pressure driving outward. They should have won by every logical measure. Every material advantage favored them completely. Yet they didn't just lose. They were so thoroughly defeated that they never tried again despite having ships. Their entire culture built on expansion accepted a boundary for the first time. Why did this happen? Because warfare isn't just about weapons and technology. It's about will, knowledge, adaptation to circumstances. The natives possessed what Vikings couldn't perfect, even with centuries: unity between warrior and terrain. Every tree was an ally in combat. Every shadow offered advantage to the defender. You can't conquer a people who are the land they defend. who know every rock and stream. Vikings understood oceans perfectly from generations of sailing. Natives understood forests equally well from birth. In Newfoundland, forest trumped ocean decisively. The parallel lessons echo through time across centuries. Afghanistan earned the title Graveyard of Empires using similar principles repeatedly. Soviet technology, American firepower, both failed against defenders who merged with landscape. Vietnam taught identical lessons about guerrilla warfare. Technological superiority means nothing when every step might be your last in hostile terrain. When the land itself seems hostile to invaders, when defenders need only patience while invaders need everything, food, supplies, reinforcements. Full circle to our opening paradox that seemed impossible. The most feared warriors on earth met farmers and hunters with primitive weapons. Stone Age met Iron Age in combat. The outcome should have been genocide of the natives. Instead, stone won against all odds. Patience conquered aggression in the end. Knowledge defeated strength completely. In those forests, 300 native warriors accomplished what no European army could manage. They stopped the Vikings cold in their tracks, made them flee in terror. The Atlantic Ocean became wider that day in perception, not physically, but psychologically in the Norse mind. For 500 years, it remained a barrier Norse ships wouldn't cross westward. When Europeans finally returned in Columbus's ships, they came in different ships with different weapons, different diseases that proved more deadly than any weapon, but they faced descendants of warriors who'd already won this war once before against invaders. The memory remained in oral tradition. History pivoted in a Newfoundland forest during those days of battle, and the pivot point was a stone arrowhead in Viking flesh, proving that sometimes the old ways are stronger than the new. Sometimes primitive weapons defeat advanced technology. Sometimes the defenders of their homeland defeat the greatest military force in the known world. The Vikings learned this lesson in blood and never forgot it. America would remain free of European colonization for 500 more years because of what happened in those forests, because stone defeated steel when everyone thought it impossible, because determination and knowledge of terrain trumped technology and training. The natives had saved their world without knowing it, buying centuries of freedom before the inevitable return of Europeans. But in 1021 A.D., they had won completely and decisively. The Vikings never returned to test themselves again against an enemy they couldn't defeat. The sagas remember. The archaeological evidence confirms, and the lesson remains eternal, that the land itself can be a weapon in the hands of those who truly know it.